Well, my final game in part one of this DVD comes from a tournament played in Russia in 2007 between Anatoly Terentiev, graded 2254, and again this guy Grigory Yarish, who seems to make a career out of the Qd8 system and scores very well with it. Again, it's the main line, with white bringing his bishop out to c4, bishop f5, knight f3, e6, queen e2, knight f6, now that white's idea of knight e5 and then g4 and h4 has been delayed. White castles, black plays bishop e7, white goes h3, black plays knight b d7. We've seen these moves before, it's a standard black setup. White's bishop moves out of the way of the d7 knight, perhaps starting the long-winded process of getting that pawn moving on c2. Black castles, white goes bishop f4, and now knight comes into d5. Alright, bishop drops back to b2. Looks like a slight loss of time. Black moves in on the queen side with a5. And perhaps the purpose of this game is to show you the effectiveness of black's pawn on a4. As white moves to knight e4, regrouping that knight on c3, and now black goes a4, bishop a2, and now knight f6. Okay, the middle game is about to begin. Black is in perfectly good shape. Note the pawn on a4, very thematically tying down the white queen side, and now black makes a standard challenge to the strongly placed white knight on e4. How is white going to get any advantage at all? Well, I don't think he's going to get it by taking on f6. White has perhaps slightly more space here. But on the other hand, what is he going to do? The problem for white is that if he goes knight g3, which of course is the move he would like to make, keeping the pieces on, black could just simply take off that pawn on c2. So I think knight f6 was a very good move. It forced an exchange of pieces. Black's got slightly less space, so the more pieces that come off, the more comfortable his position becomes. And now white is left thinking, well, how am I going to get anything in this position? Alright, well, he played his only good move, I think, bishop b4. Now the queen protects c2, and black's move is more or less forced, rook to e8. But of course, that's a useful move for black, because as we can see, the rook is now on the same file as white's queen. This makes the queen's life slightly uncomfortable. c4. So we're going to see how to play against this setup. Again, very thematic, very normal in this system. White is trying to make something of his position, so naturally he plays c4. But once he does so, you know, this pawn on d4 is starting to become a little bit creaky. e5, very sharply seen. Black is intending to activate this bishop on f5, and suddenly we see that c4 was a serious mistake. Pawn on d4 is creaking horribly, and yeah, I really started to dislike white's position intensely. Well, white took on e5. Of course, that allows black to plant his bishop in on d3. Not actually sure what else white could do in this position. I mean, if you play rook a d1, black simply takes on d4, and then the rook on e8 comes to life against the white queen. Going back to e5, yes, white can push on with d5. Then black can start to consider moves like e4, and his whole position is coming to life. I mean, already that knight on f3 is starting to look very, very embarrassed. He doesn't want to go back to e1, but of course, if he goes back to d2, then black can simply take on d5 and take again. And well, white is in incredible difficulties already. So, funnily enough, it wasn't at all easy for white after e4. He just pointed out that the move, if we retract one move further back, that the move c4 was a serious mistake. White should have simply contented himself with a simple move like rook a d1. But of course, he's not better in this situation. After, for instance, queen c7, you know, black is perfectly all right. But after d takes e5, bishop came into d3, queen goes to e3, and now really black should be much better after bishop takes f1. Rook takes f1. White would very much like to have taken on f6 in that position, but he loses his queen. So this means black can just pile up on that pawn on e5. White pins the knight temporarily, Black is swift to get out of the pin. White is equally swift to protect his pawn. Black improves the position of his queen. White protects the pawn, so all very logical moves. And now Black shuts down the bishop on a2 by playing c5. Bishop b1. White is anxious to regroup this bishop. And g6 is again very logical by Black, again shutting down that bishop from attacking h7. Queen f4. This obliges the bishop to retreat, but the bishop happily retreats to g7. Rook e4. As long as lines are closed, there's no reason why White's bishop and pawn should be inferior to Black's rook. What Black's got to do is to open the game up and make sure that his extra material counts. He's got to get his rooks on open files at this position to actually effect this transformation. So f5. He takes f6. Off come the queens. This is a very good deal for Black because suddenly the rooks have open lines. Rook f8. Another canny move. Bishop comes into e4. Bishop takes f6. Bishop takes b7. With the opening of lines has come additional winning chances for Black, excuse me. And this is why White is forced to exchange rooks here. Of course, he doesn't want to do that. Rook takes f8. B takes c3. And now rook f6. So very well played by Black. He's opened up the game. Rook f6 prevents bishop c6. And now Black should really be in good shape towards angling for the win. His plan is to perhaps improve the position of the rook. The rook would happily come across up to b3 and take off White pawns on the queen side. I don't think White can hold it. The bishop is a one-dimensional piece in this situation. King comes up to g7. If Black just puts all his pieces on dark squares, what does the bishop exactly do here? So anyway, the rook is thinking about becoming active now on b6. King g7 first. Knight g5. Rook b6, hardly surprising. Knight comes to e4, perhaps to keep the Black king out of the game. In comes the rook as advertised. Bishop c6. Knight b6, protecting that precious pawn on a4. I think that's the pawn that's going to win the game for Black. Knight takes c5. Rook takes a3. Again, it boils down to the passed pawn. Rook a1 check. King e2. a3. White resigns. Again, a very easy game to understand and a very logical game too. Well, this brings us to the end of part one of the DVD. We've covered a lot of ground. We've seen what might happen in the main line when White puts his bishop on c4. Try to understand that Black's move order is almost new, hardly seen in the theory books. The important thing to remember is that you delay the entry of the knight on g8 into the game to the most propitious moment. By doing so, you take the sting out a lot of White's most aggressive variations. White's had a lot of good results in the past against Queen d8 by pushing those kingside pawns up the board. It's hardly possible to do this against our little system. So in part two of this DVD, I'll be looking at other lines for White when Black plays Queen takes d5, and I'll be rounding up some loose ends in variations other than the main line. So I look forward to seeing you then. Until then, farewell.